reasons, but we appreciate that you came out for what we think, what I know is an important conversation about housing, and housing can get a little weedy, but this Citywide Housing Incentive Program is very important. It's very consequential. It's the most important housing program possibly in decades in LA. And it's going to be up to us, the voters, to make sure it gets passed. So that's why I thought it was important to share it with you. And we're also very fortunate to have Brian Levy with us, a kind of newer member to IKAR. And since he's a very modest man, I will tell you, he's a PhD economist from a fancy institution, Harvard. And he he works in economic development. He did a great deal of work in his hometown of South Africa, post-apartheid, in economic development there. Then I guess he emigrated to DC in the United States, and is a tenured professor at Johns Hopkins, and also many years at the World Bank as an economist in economic development, and then migrated further west to join us here in LA and found his way to IKAR and our organizing, and now teaches at the Luskin School at UCLA. And I've been very fortunate to collaborate with him on this. He's really smart. We swap ideas. We've been learning together. So Brian's going to frame this conversation, how we got here, why it matters, and then I will get into the weedy, not too weedy, I hope, discussion of what CHIPS actually does and why it matters. So Brian, I'll turn it over to you and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Let me share my screen and then we can get started. Just take this slide to the top. Sorry, just got to get the right slide. That was the last one. There we go. So I have been for many, many years passionate about taking...
Oh, good. Yeah, full screen.
Yeah, taking what I do into concrete problems and exploring how we can make progress. And moving, it's been a slow move to the LA area and to California over the last 3 to 4 years. Sort of obviously, the issue of affordable housing and homelessness just emerges. And so I've just plunged into it and learned a great deal from Tony. So here's what we're going to do this evening. I'm going to frame the issue around what I will call LA's 3 housing crises and how we got there. And then Tony will talk about how we are responding to these crises, both before CHIPS and then what CHIPS does. So let me go straight to it, and let me just flag for you what the 3 crises are. So the first crisis is the crisis, obvious, of homelessness. It's a crisis in which a combination of extreme poverty and high rents combine to fuel homelessness. I will then, after talking a bit about that, I'll then talk a little bit about our failure to build, which is at the root of much of this. And then I will talk about the other 2 crises, the crisis of housing unaffordability for the working poor and a crisis of the missing middle in the housing market. And Tony will elaborate on much of this, including especially the last part. So let me begin with this. This is stark and striking. California is an affluent state and an affluent country in the world. California also adjusting for housing costs, and they're very careful measures done that provide floors and measures and benchmarks of absolute poverty and what that is. The US poverty threshold is $35,000 for a 4-person household. California's is $40,000, and California, adjusting for housing, has the highest percentage of the population living in absolute poverty of all states in the United States. And within California, Los Angeles County has the highest percentage of the population living in absolute poverty. And these are startling and stark and sobering numbers. And I believe some of the other numbers might also be sobering. Now, just to take this and move it into the first crisis, who becomes homeless? Who becomes homeless in a society are the most vulnerable in that society. And there's a lot that can be said about the most vulnerable and homelessness and the link between them. But given the purpose of this evening's session, I just want to make one fundamental point. And this book, it's a brilliant book, and it has a title that many people first rebel against until they read it and they see the key point, which is homelessness is a housing problem. You see data on the slide as to our numbers in homelessness. I won't go through those. What I do want to note on those numbers is one thing. Often when we think about homelessness, we think about the people we see on the streets. In fact, that's the tip of an iceberg. About over 80,000 people, 87,000 people become newly homeless every year. 80,000 of those exit homelessness. So it's a net increment of 7,000. So our population builds up over time. But these are startling, startling numbers. Poor people in LA become homeless. Why? It's not because there's something uniquely different about the poor in LA. What it is that there is something uniquely different about our housing market. And this captures it. Basically, what these graphs do is they essentially show, if you want to ask which cities have high homelessness, the cities with high homelessness are the cities that have high rents. There's essentially no relationship between one of the classic bogeymen that gets talked about around homelessness, which is illicit drug use and homelessness across cities, different parts in the country, range of distribution that not tied to homelessness. So why is it that it is high rents that produce homelessness? Well, the answer coming from that book is right there on the left-hand side. Rents don't drop to zero. If you have a reasonable income and you get squeezed, you move to a lower rent place. But at some point, you hit a floor. And if that floor is set high, then you just don't have the income, you have nowhere to go, and you become homeless. So when we say the floor is set high, why is the floor so high in LA? Well, the floor on rents is high in LA because we have failed to build. And these next two slides, I thank Tony for. I poached them from you, Tony. The first one is this. If we look across metropolitan areas in the US, a rent-burdened household is a household where rents account for more than 30% of one's monthly income. And Los Angeles has the highest percentage of the citizens of the population in LA that are rent burdened of almost any city in the United States. And corresponding to that, it has the lowest vacancy rate of any city in the United States. So we have a massive, we see homelessness as follows from the relatively high rents. The high rents follow from the shortfall, from these low vacancies, the shortfall of housing, and all of that is because of this. These data from 1990 to 2018, the red horizontal line there is the line where if we had kept up with demand, it's what we would have been building each year. And you can see when you look at this over the last 30 years, with the exception of 5 of them, we have fallen way, way short of the demand for housing. So it is no surprise that there's a massive shortfall of housing. It's no surprise that rents are high. It's no surprise, given the high rents, that we also are sitting with the largest homelessness crisis on a per capita basis in the country. But now, oops, sorry. How did we get to this? So that was part of it. We didn't build. Why didn't we build? Well, here's part of the answer. It's a combination of zoning history and other regulatory and cost drivers that have produced our environment. So one I'll come back to in a moment is redlining, and how redlining and single family zoning got linked together historically. Another factor on zoning is what was called the density rebellion, the slow growth environmental movement, which cut the population accommodated in the city by zoning in half in the early 70s, from 8 million to 4.5 million. And then a whole series of other regulatory strictures on building. And then we've got the time, risk, and bureaucratic red tape associated with trying to build, which increases cost by about 35% per unit. This is labor rules, environmental rules, building standards. It can take 6 to 8 years to build an affordable housing development. There are 10 separate housing agencies to approve, their lawsuits in all directions. So we've basically made it impossible to build. And we've made it especially impossible to build in the relatively more affluent parts of LA. So this is a startling slides, again, thanks to Tony. This slide dates back from the 1930s, and the areas in red, purple, are the areas that were redlined. Those outside of those redlined areas, it was essentially, this was a segregated city. If you were Black, you could not live outside those redlined areas. Now, that's not formally true any longer, but look what the consequences are. If we look at the current household income across that map, we discover that the areas where Black people could live in the 1930s are precisely the areas today where you have the lowest incomes. And they also are the areas where today you have the greatest degrees of overcrowding. So both of these, the zoning history and the unit cost of housing, account for the massive shortfall that we see. So let me now, well, just to say also, we've been talking about fair housing for decades. I imagine that this slide that we have here, again, this one is thanks to Tony. This dates back from the 1960s, all kinds of pressing for affirmatively furthering fair housing. We don't formally discriminate, but there's been very limited action, as you've seen in those data, in terms of what's actually changed. So now we see there's a crisis of homelessness rooted to housing. There's a failure to build. And let me now go into the remaining two crises and what they look like, because they are different than the homelessness one, but they have roots that are similar. Let me start then with the crisis of the unaffordability for the working poor. So what do we mean first by the working poor? So there are a bunch of different definitions, and the slide shows a variety of different numbers. I won't go through each and every one of them with you. What I think I just would be useful to take away from this slide is that the working poor comprise a 4-person household earning roughly less than $60,000, anything from zero when you're effectively going to be homeless through $60,000, or an individual earning less than $30,000. That's what you see here. That working poor are roughly 1/3 of the population of LA County. And as you can see in these data, especially at the bottom end, there's essentially no housing, which meets the criterion of 30% of median income for a household as being affordable that is available. So the working poor cannot afford to actually house themselves without support. What can be done to address that? There are a variety of ways of addressing it. There's the possibility of subsidies. I'll say something more about the rental subsidy, especially Section 8 in a moment. Public housing, which incidentally, California, I think back in the I don't know if it was the 50s or 70s, basically a law was passed in the state level. It said, thou shalt not build public housing. Rent control can help. And as Tony's going to discuss, incentivizing construction. But just noting the core point here, the core point here is if you are earning as a family of 4 up to less than $60,000 or individual $25,000, $30,000, you can't really afford to find a place that you can live in. You need to be subsidized. Now, there's good news and bad news here. The good news is that there are lots of subsidy programs. The Section 8 housing choice vouchers, federal government provides $33 billion of money for those. You only qualify for them if you earn less than 50% of the area median income, which is what I'm talking about the working poor. And so you can see how that works. There are 2.3 million low-income families using these vouchers, but nationally, only 1 in 4 eligible families who are eligible to get the subsidy, actually receive rental assistance because there's just not enough money. And I believe that number is even lower, the proportion of eligible families in LA. You probably know that every couple of years, LA City says we're going to open up the queue for the lottery. So you can participate in the lottery to get a voucher. And they open the queue for the lottery and they close the queue within 48 hours because it gets filled almost immediately. And then if you make the queue, you still wait for 2 more years. So there's this massive, massive crisis. This is the second crisis of affordability. A crisis can only be addressed by engaging in the public domain. So now let me come to the third crisis. And I want to note that as someone new to LA, the crisis that is most immediate and visible is, of course, the crisis of homelessness. But when we look across the world, all 3 of these are crises which in some sense are fundamental and existential to the health of a city. It's clear with homelessness. It's clear I believe also with respect to the fact that the working poor can't afford to house themselves, but it's also clear with respect to what we call the missing middle in the housing market. So what do I mean by the missing middle? Tony will say more about this particular slide, but here's the basic point. If we look at the period between 2014 and 2019 and we ask, where did construction happen for housing? So there was plenty of construction taking place at the areas above the moderate income. If the median income is about $90,000 and income above $110,000, $120,000, that area's got plenty of housing. There also was some construction, and it's been accelerating at the very low and the low parts of income. But basically, in the same period, nothing was built for the moderate income groups. Why? What's going on here? Let me summarize it like this. Basically, what we have, and once again, here in Los Angeles, we're at the extreme edge of something that is an issue that is manifesting itself across the United States, and that I describe here as the imploding middle. This is literally the imploding middle of our society and our city, and in many ways our country. Earnings are stagnant, rents are rising. This is a group that does not qualify for public support because its income's above that threshold, and there's no housing construction. As you see on the right side of this, basically over the period between 1980 and 2014, there was a 55% increase in median rents and only a 13% increase in median incomes. If you look at this graph on the left, and this graph on the left is in fact an understatement of the real dimensions of what it shows. So what the graph on the left is basically saying is if you work in a job, which is a relatively high-wage professional job, then over the last 40 years, between 1979 and 2018, you've done okay. Adjusting for inflation, your real income has risen by about 43%. If, on the other hand, you're in a typical mid-wage or low-wage job, then effectively, over the course of the last 40 years, you have seen no increase in your earnings, even as rents have been rising. So we, like much of the country, are living in an environment of an imploding middle with all kinds of consequences. Consequences which I just want to note, we experience less in California than in other parts of the country because our social safety net is strong. I mentioned earlier that there are about 15% of the population of California lives in poverty. If it were not for the various safety nets that are there, that number would be up to 25%. So that's what we have. We have three crises. There's a crisis which is the tip of the iceberg of homelessness. There's a crisis of unaffordability for the working poor. And then there's a crisis of a middle which falls between all cracks, which has been squeezed, not just by the way in which public funding flows, but also, and it's much starker than the numbers that I've presented, also squeezed by the massive concentration of income flowing to the top of the distribution. And this is where we find ourselves. My one last comment, then I will pause, see if anybody has any questions, then I will hand over to Tony. What do we make of this? It's easy and ultimately, I think, not helpful to say, oh, this is appalling. We live in a massive, terrible, unequal society. We have to fix it. We need to make a more equal society. I agree, but the question is, what do we do tomorrow? What do we do over the next few years? And I think what we're going to see in Tony's part of this presentation, if we can actually get housing construction accelerated across the range of all three of these, including the missing middle, then we can make a real dent in the problem in a practical way, with a practical entry point that can make a difference. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, see if anybody has any questions or comments, and hand over to Tony.
Sipra.
Sipra.
Question. In my neighborhood, I live around the Grove. there are a lot of duplexes and fourplexes and sixplexes, whatever, that have been around here since probably the 1920s, 1930s. Why are rents so high? I understand high rent, new buildings and that Wilshire corridor and wherever else they're building. But I don't understand why the rents go up and up when the buildings are probably being paid for by dad or grandpa years ago. And I know people's insurance goes up and I know sewage costs go up. But do you want to do a quick explainer as to, as I see it, the rents, like you said, the rents are going up way above people's income for buildings that have been around a long time. That's my
so couple of answers that are all variations on the same theme. First, the rents go up because there's no rent control. That's another way of saying we live in a capitalist economy, and in the absence of rent control, the housing owners can charge what the market will bear, and when housing is as scarce as it is, then prices will go up, and that's what we're seeing. That's it.
But we do have rent control, though. You know, every year, I know the whole thing, but every year, technically, the city says you can go up 3% or 4%. It was obviously during COVID, that was, you know, static, but I just kind of see
it's up to a point. I mean, I don't know what part of the UK you remember, but I know that my wife Lou lived in Sweden for many years, and Sweden basically has rent control throughout its inner cities, and housing is just simply affordable. Been true for decades. The right comment was made in the chat that the rent can be reset when tenants move out. By the way, so I just want to note that we need to be careful, though, of a series of fallacies here. There's a fallacy that says if only we introduce rent control, then the problems would be solved. They wouldn't, because there's a massive scarcity of housing. And similarly, there's a fallacy that says, but there isn't a scarcity of housing because we see all these empty elite apartments. Now, it's true that there are some, but if you actually look at the magnitudes, and you look at the magnitudes of how we have and haven't built and where we've built and haven't built, there is a massive, massive shortfall of housing. So even if one were able to institute and make more robust rent control, that would still not obviate for the need for urgent increase in construction.
Anybody else? Or all right, well, we'll have time. We should at the end for a whole Q&A on the whole thing. So let me share this. Everybody seeing that? Good. All right.
So you started screen share. There it is.
Are we good? Yeah, we're good. So I wanted to circle back to this map, and hold on, let me get my notes here. Hold on, I'm working off of two things. Here we are. I wanted to circle off the redlining map and the map on the left, because it compounds what Brian was saying. The map on the left is our current zoning map of LA, and some of you have seen this before, but all the yellow is single family housing. And depending on what city council district you're in, 72 or I think CD5, it's up to 85% of LA is zoned for single family housing. And because single family housing is so expensive, it's unobtainable, and it's effectively redlining. So these two maps are startlingly similar, depressingly similar. Down in here, the brown areas is where you see more multifamily, more density. Red is industrial, but again, the maps are the same. The overcrowding, the wealth, it's all crammed in here and up in here. And this, so I also want to, and I also want to turn to LA's housing policy. Let me get myself out of the way here, because this matters a lot. This paragraph is from our housing element, which is our housing plan, which I'm going to get to in a second. And I'll read it because it's really the core of everything that LA aspires to do. And it says, it's the overall housing vision of the city of Los Angeles to create housing opportunities that enhance affordability, equity, livability, and sustainability by remedying discriminatory housing practice, creating a city with a range of housing types, sizes, and costs in close proximity to jobs, transit, amenities, and services. In keeping with a fundamental belief that housing is a human right, the city will work towards ensuring that housing stability and affordability is provided to all residents. And from this, all housing policy flows, especially in the housing element. So I will tell you this, I've worked with the planners down in city planning. I've gotten to know them, and they are serious about this. They're committed to these values, but here's the big but. They cannot do it without us. They can't dictate housing policy. They really believe, and they do, they work for the people of Los Angeles. So if the people saying no to any density anywhere show up and we don't show up, that's what's going to happen. They want this, they want to make this work. So, here we go, next slide. So what has the city done in the past to try to fix this really broken map that Brian and I have both referred to? And one big thing is this thing that I've talked about in the past. I didn't even know what it was 3 years ago. It was news to me. It's called the housing element. And by state law, every 8 years, this California law, every city and locality in the state has to produce this 8-year housing plan called a housing element. And this is that's our very beautiful cover of our housing plan, which isn't uninteresting reading, to tell you the truth. But a core piece of the housing plan is to do very careful demographic studies across our population, age, race, income levels, to determine what are going to be our housing needs for each 8-year housing cycle. And for the most recent housing element, the 21 to 2029, we're already into this housing cycle. The city determined we're going to need 486 to 487,000 new units of housing, meaning a studio, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms. And I'll get back to these other two numbers in a moment. Here's a peek behind what we need to build, and it's broken down. Oh, by the way, sorry, this is important to know. Regional Housing Needs Assessment, RHNA, RHNA, comes up in all the affordable housing conversation. So it's an important acronym to get used to. This projection is called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And here's the numbers behind it. It is broken up by income levels Brian was talking about. So for a very low income families, individuals and families, we need about 116,000 new units of housing. For lower income people on the spectrum, and again, it's 0 to 30 at area median income. Low income is 30 to 60 AMI, area median income. We're going to need about 69,000 new units of housing. And then we have this moderate to above moderate category that I think comes to about 271,000 units of new housing, all in over 456,000 units of new housing, or 57,000, 58,000 units a year. And we never come close to that. Just so going back to this chart, which the city put out, the blue is what the RHNA projection was supposed to be, what we wanted to meet. This was for the last housing cycle. And as we see, for the low and very low income, which is subsidized housing, we don't do great. And in this missing middle, we don't do it. We don't do anything. There's just no subsidies. There's no provision for it. And a market rate above moderate income, which is essentially market rate in luxury, we have no problem. And you see that anecdotally. You see luxury housing going up all over the city, which I will get to, has some affordability in it lately. And I'll explain what I mean by that. However, because we never met these targets, within the last 5 years, and I didn't look up which state law it was, the state changed how this game is played. And they said no longer can a housing element just be aspirational. You have to meet these targets. It has to be realistic. So state planning, when we turned in our housing element, they reviewed it. They said, okay, we'll give you 231,000 units. We think you have room for that. You are now missing over 255,000 units of housing. You have no place for it. So the city went back to the drawing board, and what resulted is this thing called the Citywide Housing Incentive Program. CHIPS was created to fill this missing zoning for the housing. Nor does it mean that the housing is going to get built, but it means the city's going to come up with a realistic plan where it can go. And here, this is very important here. There is extreme consequences. There's a ticking clock. If by February 15th of next year, we don't have an approved plan, and the plan has to be approved by the city council, there's drastic consequences. The state can withhold all the funding for our affordable housing. We get considerable money from the state for affordable housing. And it can also just dictate to the city, among other things, well, if you don't, and to all cities, Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, if you don't have a place for it, we'll just tell you where it goes. So there's an urgency to what's going on. And just going back to this thing of missing middle, I want to put a face on that, take a little deeper dive. but yes, that's also a big problem. We don't have it. We don't have housing for the really low to moderate income workers, and I'm going to put a face on that right now. So if we understand that and this is an important definition, when we talk about 100% affordable housing, when you hear that, what we're talking about is housing for extremely low, very low, and low income workers, families, individuals, and that generally means 0 to 60 area median income. So maybe up to $40,000, $50,000. Some housing projects will go up to 80, have a few units for 80 AMI, but not many. All the subsidies for 100% affordable are really and rightfully directed at the lowest income levels. And what are we talking about? It's like the HHH funding, that $1.1 billion dollar funding measure that was passed in like 2015, I think. That's how we subsidize housing with very low interest loans. They're risky loans. And it's city, state, and federal loans and tax credits. This whole package of funding that allows these projects what's called pencil. The banks have to get paid back. Projects have to be financially feasible. They're built with private equity. They have to be financially feasible. And the only way to do that is with very low interest loans from the city and the state and other federal tax credits. But to put a face on this, here's a sad thing to think about. An LAUSD teacher, a starting teacher, makes between $56,000 and $62,000 a year. And depending on what chart you consult, and Brian and I went back and forth on this, but according to the LA housing rent rolls, an LAUSD teacher would be a very low to low income worker, which is a tragedy. But that's an average wage, in LA. And that teacher is going to have a really hard time finding a place to live. Or the Trader Joe's worker who, we go to Trader Joe's all the time. A clerk will start at $35,000 a year, and maybe make up to 40. And this is a kind of a wide range. If you make it up to a store manager, an assistant store manager, you might be making a little over $80,000 a year. And you're still, depending on what chart you look at, what rental and income chart, you're a low to moderate income worker, and you're hard pressed to find a place to live near your Trader Joe's. And then to give you another idea, dental hygienists, they do a little better. They make between 80 and 100,000, maybe a little more. So they're classified as moderate income workers, but they're also competing for scarce housing. And again, just to remind you, in the above 60% to 100% area median income, there's no subsidy for that housing. So what happens is, so it doesn't get built. And so what happens is you have these low to moderate income professionals, our teachers, our dental hygienists, our Trader Joe's workers, all competing with the extremely low and very low income workers for the scarce housing, driving up rents all over the city. And as Brian said, and in housing conversations, you can imagine it as a game of musical chairs. The most vulnerable are going to lose. The ones who are not going to get a chair or a place to live are the poorest. They're going to get knocked out by anybody who can pay a little bit more money. And it's brutal. You move onto your car, onto your friend's couch, and then onto the street. And as Brian said, the revolving door of people moving in and out of homelessness. So the bottom line is, the city needs both 100% affordable housing, subsidized housing for the 0 to 60 area median income workers. And we definitely need missing middle housing for the 60, 80, 100% area median income workers, young professionals, working professionals. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that you need to understand. Missing middle doesn't always, actually, in fact, doesn't necessarily refer to middle class or middle income workers. It actually refers to a kind of scale of housing that doesn't get built. So I want to quickly touch upon that. There's basically 3 models of housing in the housing conversation. So here's a typical 100% affordable housing project. This one was built in Santa Monica. It's called Los Flores Apartments. Generally, all developers, they want to build as many units as they can. So I got a plane passing, because it helps their bottom line. If you're going to build, you want to build 50 and up. You want to build 100 and up. Most of 100% affordable housing will be like this: 73 units to 125 to 150. And I can tell you the average HHH cost of 1 unit of affordable housing is about $614,000. And the subsidy they get from city and state in terms of low interest loans is about 114,000 per unit. And so you see a lot of this kind of thing, but that's for the lower incomes. Now we have this new thing that you probably have heard about called transit-oriented communities, and you see them popping up all over our corridors. They're called TOCs. They're kind of a different thing. They're mainly market rate, but if the developer will guarantee 8 to 10% affordability, and there's all these complicated menus, but if they will set aside 8 to 10% of the building for affordability, they can build more stories, add more density, so they get a density bonus. So it doesn't cost the city anything other than allowing them to build a little taller along our corridors. Generally, I will tell you, most developers will build the fewest affordable, extremely affordable apartments as they can. There's a whole menu you could put in moderate income and low income. They do the fewest units, so you get about 8 to 10% affordable units out of it. And then there's this, which doesn't get built, and that's both a typology, a certain kind of house called missing middle. And these are less dense. They're meant to be lower slung, not as tall, 3 stories, 4 stories, townhouses, different types of housing typologies. And the idea that these would be mixed income. So you would have market rate or working people, maybe making 150,000 and up, living with lower income people, moderate income people, and maybe some low income people, which is socially speaking a very good housing model. It's good for everybody. But this doesn't get built. There's no subsidies for it, and there's really no mechanism for it. But CHIPS is going to try to create this housing model. So, just a quick glance, what has the city done in the past? What are the tools in the city and the state's toolbox to create housing? And as we discussed, funding and subsidizing affordable housing like HHH, federal tax credits, those are all, you got to fund. So that's one leg of the stool, as they say. The other 2 very important legs of the stool are these things called, that you've probably heard about, streamlining and density bonuses. So let's take a quick look at what that is. What does streamlining do? Well, Brian touched upon it, but until recently, most 100% affordable housing projects had to go back to the city council 6 and 7 times to get reevaluated, essentially each time. And it would really be up to each city council member is the mayor of their council district, and they essentially, the unspoken rule is they can thumb up or thumb down on a variety of housing projects. So there's a lot of risk involved. You don't know if your project's going to go forward, and it costs you a lot of money. So there's repeated trips to the city council, and then there's 10 separate housing agencies, and then of course there's all the pushback from the neighbors, classically known as NIMBYs, not in my backyard, lawsuits. So how that changed is, instead of doing all that, streamlining creates a situation where you build by right, known as ministerial approval. So if you check all the boxes, you have the right height, the right amount of affordability, you can build by right, and you don't have to keep going back to the city council over the course of years, spending a fortune in carrying costs and legal costs. And a very major change was Mayor Bass's first day in office was this Executive Directive 1, and it's went to all the housing agencies, especially planning, because they're the first stop. And they said, if a housing project meets all the criteria, 60 days for an approval versus years and years. And they've been flooded with applications, and they've been cranking them out. I think there's like 14,000 applications. Remains to be seen if all that will get built, but the idea is a very good one. And now ED1 is being codified into the city code, and we'll see where, we've talked about this in the past, we'll see where that ends up. But the other important thing that streamlining also provides for is what's called density bonuses. And here's a good little picture that explains that. On the left is like your base zoning regulation, your base and under measure Prop U, which Brian didn't get into, but essentially Prop U passed in 1986, was a major anti-zoning measure, and it's why the corridors look the way they do. It essentially said we could downzone the corridors from building at least 3 stories or more. So you only could build 1.5 stories. That's why Pico and Olympic and South, our home base on South La Cienega, look the way they do. There's been some workarounds. But under the base zoning, you have a 1 or 2 story squat building that has a few apartments, maybe some retail on the ground floor, perhaps. What it says is, if you're 100% affordable, we say, oh, great, we'll give you a 30% density bonus. You can build more units. And what the city is really trying to encourage is building closer to transit and in better neighborhoods to fix this map. So you get added bonuses, density bonus, the closer you are to good transit, and transit can be a bus line that runs every 15 to 30 minutes, or rapid transit express buses, things like that. And we'll get into that in a second. And then in the middle is this more mixed income creature thing that has yet to be built. Whereas if you will, some of your building could be market rate and some would be covenanted for low to moderate income, and we'll give you some density bonuses depending on where you want to put it. So that's what density does. So what does CHIPS do? Finally, we're getting to sort of the, how does it build on all this? The whole point of CHIPS, this rezoning, finding these extra 255,000 units, is to extend both affordable housing and mixed income housing into all these yellow areas that have avoided it. And I will give you this caveat: the hills, which are high fire zones and have no transit and really don't have a lot of jobs, they're exempt, and that makes sense. So if you don't want any high density stuff near you, take all your money and move to the hills and try to find the insurance for it. But the main point of CHIPS is to extend multifamily density house, housing between 5 and 7 stories along our corridors into sorry, well, wait a second, I lost my plate. Absolutely, hold on. So in the North Valley and in here, and this is just a little better, you're able to see it. We can't tell Beverly Hills or Santa Monica or Culver City what to do. They're their own cities. They are working similarly on their own housing elements, identical problems, but we can build in here. We could start to extend the map equitably outside the red light zones and into areas that really need housing. But here's the reality. Here's the, if we call it a dirty little secret behind CHIPS. CHIPS does balance equity with the political reality. Equity being improving the map, fixing the map, and we don't have any more room for single family zoning. But the truth is, CHIPS extends 100% affordable housing and mixed income housing and faith-based housing, which is what IKAR wants to build, along our corridors and transitional corridors. It tiptoes around single family neighborhoods, also known as R1. And that's just the reality of it. We could talk about the end of, the ethics and the politics of it, but you can be sure, and it's already a big issue, if the city planning said we're going to start building major developments, and there's other ways of developing in R1, other state codes, accessory dwelling units. There's other things we could talk about, but it would be a losing proposition. So that's what CHIPS is trying to do, and we can just talk about the ethics of it. So just so you quickly understand, I'm not going to go into any depth. CHIPS is essentially 3 housing programs built into one. On the left is the state density program. And really what that means is, and then this slide shows it to you, I'll just go there. Since 2013, there have been at least 17 state bills that have been passed that have to be incorporated into the city housing code, and they haven't been. So I'm not going to go into any detail on these, but these density bonuses have to be incorporated into the city side. So it's pretty weedy, and that's what's going to happen there. And then it's this one that interests us, the Mixed Income Incentive Program, and I'll get back to that in a second. The Affordable Housing Incentive Program essentially codifies what we've had already, which is if you're 100% affordable, or if you recall, SB4 created the ability for faith-based institutions, mosques, synagogues, churches, to build on their land. So it codifies that. And again, it says if you check all the boxes, you have the right height and the setbacks and the right affordability, you can build by right. So what's quite new in CHIPS, and all of this is important, is this middle one, the Mixed Income Incentive Program, which essentially creates much more housing by right, with more density along opportunity corridors, meaning in better neighborhoods where there's transit rich, and on those corridors leading up to the transitional areas. And I think here, I'm getting to this slide. So in a nutshell, sort of as I said, CHIP incentivizes 100% affordable housing and mixed income housing and faith-based housing along these long sad, barren, undeveloped corridors. You could, Pico, my neighborhood, Olympic, Westwood, La Cienega, Western, and along transitional corridors, where you have mixed zoning, some commercial and some multifamily. And here's a visual, so you can get a quick glimpse of what it looks like. If you imagine on the left is one of our corridors, South La Cienega, and our Pico, where you might see larger housing developments, where I would argue vehemently it belongs. And we're talking 5 to 7 stories, maybe 8 if there's a lot of amenities. You put in a nice public, not park, but area, public area. So you can get an 8-story if you add an extra checkbox. And then in here are these transitional corridors. I think of Redondo or North Larchmont Boulevard, where you really could use transitional housing. And this is only supposed to be 3 stories and 10 units. This plan is still being tweaked. I don't know if that's enough density. But the idea is you have an opportunity corridor, a transitional corridor leading to a residential neighborhood. And the residential neighborhood, other than the people who live right behind, goes untouched under this plan. And then the other important things CHIPS does is it encourages different kinds of housing typologies, vernaculars, housing models. Some are quite classic, but tries to reinvent them. There's the multiplex and row houses, and I think this is a different kind of multiplex. Courtyards and bungalows are very classic in California architecture. How to reinvent that in an interesting way. Also, they want to encourage courtyard paseos, which are passageways, breezeways in housing, a very European Mediterranean thing. Yards, different kinds of front entry. So they want to create sort of a standardized ideas, allowing architects and planners to do something more interesting. And here's a visual. These are some townhouses that are a little newer. The old courtyards where they're wonderful, create a different version of that. Down in the left corner is actually, this is the Rose Apartment built by a prominent architect who's been helping me on all this. And this is a really interesting housing model. It's for seniors and transitional youth. It's about 35 apartments on a smaller lot. She did a really nice job. They're all small units, and they're built for a reasonable amount of money. We want to build more of these. And this is sort of a townhouse model. I've seen a lot of these on Redondo. They're probably more upper income, but we'd like them to be much more accessible. And as Brian said, we need more of them. And so really, that's the basic idea of CHIPS. The closer you are to quality transit, the more housing you can build. Again, 5 to 7 stories, rarely 8, if there's a really great amenity. And again, extending housing for our workers. And by the way, I did omit one thing, which I'll quickly touch on. One of the highest causes of greenhouse gases is vehicle miles traveled. So if you can imagine a teacher or Trader Joe's worker has to drive in every day 25 to 50 miles from Santa Clarita or San Pedro, and they're doing 50, 60 miles round trip, it adds enormously to the greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions. So the whole idea is to get the workers, and in CD5, 85% of their workers come from outside the district, to live near where they work, so they can walk to Trader Joe's or walk to their school or take a bus or a bike, not drive. And so that's what it's trying to encourage. And if an affordable housing developer checks all these boxes, and they're myriad boxes, they can build by right. They don't have to make these repeated trips to the city council and to neighborhood councils, getting the right to do it. And so you get, and this is just a snapshot, complicated charts like these that I don't even totally understand. But in terms of transit area, T1 is like the least transit rich. It might be near a couple of bus lines that run every 15 to 30 minutes. T4 would be near a new rail station or something like that on a bus line. Opportunity corridors, with frequent, so this combines both with frequent bus services, high quality transit, and even better transit. You get more and more bonuses. You get up to 3 stories, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's a complicated formula, but that's what it looks like. And ultimately, you're going to get a much better map, a much fairer map. And you can go on the website, I can put in the link, and you can see, this is sort of around our area, where the city envisions putting new housing along the corridors, leaving R1, the single family residences, because it's not just Hancock Park, it's Leimert Park, communities of color also don't want it. They like their single family homes, and that is uniquely LA, like it or not. But that's the basic idea. And the bottom line is CHIPS has to pass the city council. They have to approve it, thumbs up or thumbs down by February 15th of next year, 2025. And if we don't, we could lose millions in state funding, and the state can just dictate where housing will go. And as Brian and I think I've now laid out, if we don't do it, we're back to square one. There's no plan B. This is plan B. Very briefly, so you understand, this is kind of a longer, and we'll probably talk about this from time to time. But the reason we're taking the time to do this tonight, in 11 days, on July 25th, there's going to be the first major public hearing. The staff will present CHIPS if you want to go, and I'll give you all the information, and we will email you. You can attend, and you can also make a public comment, or you can email public comment up until the August 1st. And then what's going to happen from August through September, city planning is going to take all their public comment, and they're going to put out a slightly tweaked, revised draft of CHIPS. In September, they're going to submit the new draft. Right now, it's scheduled September 26th. There will be an important public hearing before the City Planning Commission, which is different than the City Council. They get the first crack at hearing it, asking questions, revising it. And then, very importantly, in the fall and winter of this year, it's going to go to the city council for various committee hearings, and then a final city council, and then February 15th, or before, it's got to be turned over to state planning. So we're going to be revisiting this. So if you find any of this compelling, and I hope you do, and not too totally confusing, on July 25th in the evening, and we will send this all to you in an email, 5 to 6, they're going to do a presentation, and then it's going to be open for public comment. And if you don't want to sit through another presentation of this or wait to speak, you could actually just send an email, and we will send you again this information, so, in support of CHIPS, saying you're with IKAR and where you live. And again, we'll send you a reminder, or I'm going to try to attend the meeting and make a statement. And we will send you a script, but it's basically, I live, in West Hollywood, or I live in Mid Wilshire, and I support CHIPS. And I think that's it. If I haven't talked you to death, what time is it? So we have a little time left for a conversation, and that's the presentation. I will stop sharing my screen too.
Can I ask a question?
Please, who's that?
Me, your wife.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Go ahead, wife.
When you had the slide that showed the 3 different housing models and that they go up in density, the mixed income, is that addressing what you were talking about with the missing middle?
Yeah.
Or is mixed income, we can charge market rate and we're going to have 10% of the units super affordable? Like, is that mixed income?
Mixed income would be, you would hope, missing middle, and this is there needs to be feasibility studies. This is like a moving target. I've been working on this, but it would in theory be, you have some market rate units, probably, let's say 60-70%, 30% might be for low to moderate income workers, not extremely low. Let's try to reserve that for the market that doesn't get built. I would argue for 60 to 100% AMI, but you got to really look at that model and see, do you have enough units? Does it pencil? So it's how many units can you stuff in there, and will it pencil? So that's a kind of a very much a moving piece, but a good question, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Karen, you have your hand up.
My question is, I live in Culver City, and could I submit a comment, even if I'm not an LA resident, in favor of CHIPS, or would they say you don't can because you're not in LA?
Well, you could fake it, or you could say, I really support this, and I hope Culver City will adopt it too. Because Culver City is going through all kind. I know we're having the same kind of conversation.
Right.
So I think as LA goes, so goes Culver City. So goes. So I would urge you to say absolutely yes.
Okay.
And your voice counts.
Okay. Thank you.
Who else? Aviva, did I see?
Yeah, one, thank you so much for putting real faces or like real people to the incomes. I'm an LAUSD public teacher who lives in Palms. So like this is very, very applicable, and I'm a renter in Palms. I think I still have a lot of questions about things like, so TOCs are super controversial in Palms right now because we're seeing really, really affordable buildings get torn down to be these really like to have like, 100-unit bill or like, maybe like closer to 30-unit like buildings with like 2 affordable housing units where there used to be 20 affordable families living there. I'm kind of wondering, how do we, what can we say to this? What can we do?
I can confirm this, but I do know that part of CHIPS is if you take out 20, you gotta have 20, you gotta replace it with 20, and there has to be the right of return. That you can't, so if you're gonna displace someone, they have the right to, so that is part of city policy, that you can't just rip down, an affordable. It would be great. It's complicated because there's some, quite old housing stock, and that's sort of a separate, that would be nice to refurbish or create more. But you're absolutely right, not at the expense of displacing people, and then they can't come back.
Got it. And then my other question is, how, again, so areas like Pico Robertson, areas like Palms, how do we balance all of this? Because the more people, if we have more upscale housing, which apparently we're building a lot of, it brings in people with their upscale incomes, which increases the AMI of the neighborhood, which would then shift things around, I assume, when it comes to what is considered low income housing, what is not considered low income. So how does that work?
Brian I don't think you want to create circumstances where small developers will develop 100% affordable, where you take out the risk and the time. But if you bring in higher income workers, it doesn't impact, it'll impact AMI, but it shouldn't impact exactly what gets built. Brian, you have something you want to say there? Maybe you can do better.
There's a fraudulent argument and a real argument about building. The fraudulent argument says all construction is good, so it's great if certain people who might be developers who choose to run for mayor sometimes and want to build luxury housing get to build it because everybody wins. That's a fraudulent argument. The real argument is somehow there needs to be a massive expansion of supply of housing that built at market rate, because we're already not subsidizing the people who are below market who need the subsidy. That built at market rate builds large numbers of units that are affordable to moderate income people. So if you're a school teacher, and Tony and I have been back and forth, and you want to live in a studio apartment, that ought to be that as a school teacher living on your own or with one other person, you're in that moderate income space. If you're a school teacher with a family of 4, you're not, because then you're paying, then it's got to spread across 4. And housing is not being built to meet that. If this were a different world, one might say we need a massive expansion of public housing. We don't live in that world. It's not going to happen. Tony uses a term, which I think it's a real state, the real state development use it. It's called to pencil. If I'm going to build this, can I actually cover my costs and generate not a massive exploitative return, but a reasonable return? And at the moment, given the rules of the game, they can't. It just doesn't pencil. The market will not produce the studio and 1-bedroom apartments that the school teachers can afford. And so one way to interpret CHIPS, and Tony, I don't know if this is even more optimistic than you see it, but one way to interpret CHIPS is trying to decisively change the game so that developers will build the studio and the 1-bedroom apartments that people earning moderate incomes will be able to afford. And that can happen. It can happen in a streamlined way. It's not going to squeeze the subsidies out of the working poor who are earning way below that. And that's what CHIPS is trying to do.
Right.
Whether it succeeds, we'll see. Is that?
No, it is. It's trying to build lower to moderate income housing that doesn't require a subsidy. And they're going to say, we'll let you build a little more units, and we'll let you build by right. Just include an affordability component, and it's this missing middle thing that still needs a lot of definition, because to get it to pencil is tricky. How many units? How many units could you afford to have, you know, at below market rents and still have this project be, you know, fundable, financeable?
Yeah, and just to add one more thing, I mean, this is one of the things that has struck me as I've become involved in this issue in this context, but it's also generally true. The perfect is the enemy of the good enough. When we look at any initiative and say this initiative is not good enough, therefore we shouldn't support it, what we're actually doing is we are saying, therefore, let's stay with the status quo. And how to find our way to those spaces that says, you know, this is mixed, it's complex, but life is complex, but on balance, this is really worth doing. And I think as the Yimbys have flagged for us, and as Tony has flagged for us, the North Star of all of this is how to get much more construction coming through at rentals that people earning in the moderate income can afford. Because that's what's not happened.
And at the same time, definitely developing lower income housing.
Yes.
Because those people are workers too. I mean, you know, closer to jobs. So both markets matter, which is the point of the whole thing. Kellen, you've been waiting.
I'm just curious, you know, it seems like it would be beneficial to smaller developers. It seems like it's beneficial to most people in the city. So who's the prominent opposition?
Good question. And we're waiting to see that. It would be the classic anti-density NIMBY groups. You know, I'll tell you, the Hancock Park Homeowners Association is very vocal, and they get what they want. So I think housing has tried to come up with an offer they can't refuse. If you say we're going to build up on the corridors, you know, and all right, you know, and there's actually been a big thing over historic preservation zone neighborhoods. You know, should we leave them alone? And my council member has said yes, and maybe politically expedient to do that. You know, they're historically zoned neighborhoods, but I don't know. I'm really curious. I don't know what their argument's going to be. They say we want affordable housing. So I don't know. I honestly don't know what the no argument is on this. And if there is a no argument, it's pretty embarrassing. And then you say, so where should we put this housing? It's always someplace else. You know, where do you want the people, the 85% of the people who work in CD5 who drive from, where should they live? Should they just continue driving in and you know, and we'll continue to have people living on the streets? So it's a really good question, and that's shaping up. And we will see. It'll be interesting to see at this public hearing what people have to say. So
just want to add to that. I mean, so the things that are in CHIPS could all happen, and still nothing would happen because it still wouldn't pencil. In order for it to pencil, that number that is $600,000 per unit probably has to get down to between $300,000 and $400,000 a unit. In order for
that question, is that even possible in like the macroeconomic environment with the interest rates being what they are? Like, is that even possible?
Even without the interest rates, I mean, if you look across the country in different settings, it takes us into some really tough spaces. You know, it takes us first into the spaces that Tony flagged of local control. It takes us into the spaces as to what are the rules as to who can be on the construction site in terms of what relationship to which unions, which has been, Scott Wiener talked about that with us a year or two ago.
Labor costs are a big deal.
It also takes us into spaces of how, I'll put this crudely, how gold-plated should be the environmental requirements in these units. And, you know, every one of these, we're only 9 people left, but if we were 25, I have no doubt that we would get champions on all kinds of things that would say no. And then it doesn't pencil. So it's a really challenging question.
There is definitely a desire to get those unit costs down. Part of it is the streamlining, adding density, smaller units. I mean, you're not, you know, a luxury unit costs more. So, you know, you might have, you know, like the Rose apartments that I showed you. I think they're transition. Well, they're senior housing. They're about 350 square foot studios, comfortable, livable. You know, in 1 bedroom, it might be 500 feet. But the only way you're going to be able to create affordability in LA right now, with land prices being what they are, is more density, smaller units, faster construction, modular, can be, but it's not a magic bullet. We've become standardized, that could help a lot. So a lot of things, but that is the goal, Kellen. That is the goal. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. Does anyone have any pressing question or, Hannah, you want me to quickly do the next steps thing? Are you still there?
Go ahead, go ahead.
So I put into the chat and we will follow up. We will send you an email, maybe including this presentation, and we'll send you the slides to our community. But this is going to be the first meeting, the first major meeting on it. If you can make it, make it. There's only a few of us here. We'll see if we can't drum up a little more support in our community. We're continuing to organize our legislative meetings on the statewide bills, and we will continue to talk about that and reach out to you. And then we can give you a preview in August. Louis Abramson is going to lead us into a deeper dive into the referendums, the ballot initiatives that we're going to be supporting, so we can understand them better, especially going into the holidays when we'll want to talk about them more. So that's what's coming up, and I did put into the chat, and we'll send out how you can register for the 25th meeting or send an email. I think that's it. I think that brings us to the end of our evening. Anybody have anything? It's a small meeting now. Anything they want to contribute? All right, then I will listen. Thank you all. I'll wrap up. Thank you all so much for showing up on a Sunday night. I hope you got something out of it, and we will continue this conversation as we go forward. I don't have the music doesn't work. I haven't figured that out. So a fond good night to one and all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Really great.
All right, bye-bye.